Hello students, this is Ms. Dalton and today's video is about function characteristics. Let's start by looking at some vocabulary. When you're looking at a graph, you're going to have to identify where the positive interval is and where the negative interval. The positive interval, you want to think about it's the y values that are greater than 0. So that is going to be the part of the graph that is above the x-axis. The negative interval is where the y values are less than 0. And so when you're looking at the graph, that is going to be below the x-axis. Let's go ahead and look at our first example. In this example, if we're looking at the graph, we're going to identify where the positive interval is and where the negative interval is. So for the positive interval, I'm going to draw that in blue. Sorry, my handwriting is looking pretty bad on this one. So again, the positive interval is where the graph is above the x-axis. So it would be this piece here. And then if we look at the negative interval, I'm going to do that in yellow. The negative interval is where the y values are less than 0. So we have below the x-axis. So we have two pieces. We have this piece here and we have this piece here. Now we'll talk about later about how you write these intervals, but right now you just need to be able to recognize where they are on the graph. A few more vocabulary words for you. We have increasing interval and decreasing interval. Now it's very easy to get positive interval and increasing interval mixed up. Increasing is where the y values are increasing as the x values are increasing. So I want you to think about that as when the graph is going uphill from the left to the right. So if it's going uphill, then that piece will be considered increasing. Now, it could still be below the x-axis, and that's where we get confused, is positive is above the x-axis. Increasing, it doesn't matter, just as long as it's going from the left to right uphill. Then secondly, we have decreasing. Well, decreasing is sometimes mixed up with negative interval. But decreasing is where the y values are decreasing as the x values are increasing. So again, you're going to see this as going downhill from the left to the right. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's below or above the x-axis. It's just where it is going up or down. So now in the same example, let's identify the increasing and the decreasing intervals. So again, increasing is where it is going up from left to right, so increasing would be here. And then decreasing is where it's going down from left to right, and so the decreasing interval would be here. A few more vocabulary words. Absolute global minimum. This is the lowest point on the graph, and so I want you to think about absolute minimum is where absolutely nothing is lower than this point. We also have what's called a local minimum. So I think of local as being like a section of the graph where there is a minimum, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the lowest, the absolute lowest. And so local minimum is just going to be the lowest point on a defined interval. So it could be a section of the graph. What is the lowest point of the section of that graph? Absolute maximum is just the opposite of an absolute minimum. It is going to be the highest point on the graph. It is the absolute highest point. So there's nothing higher. Local maximum could just be a maximum on an interval. Again, there might be a maximum that is higher, but this is the local maximum for that interval. So I want you to think of like a mountain. Okay, so looking at this graph, let's first identify where the absolute maximum is. So again, think of it is the absolute highest point. So that would be right here. Now let's recognize where the absolute minimum is. So again, this is the absolute lowest point. The absolute lowest point would be right here. So this is where the absolute minimum is. Next, let's recognize where the local max is. And again, we could have a couple of different local maxes. One local max, and I'm going to mark these in red, but one local max is right here where this point is. Okay, because again, if I'm looking at the interval from here to here, this would be a high point. Another local max would be at the top of this hill right here. And then that appears to be it. Last but not least, let's recognize where the local mins are, and so those are the valleys. So we have a local min here. I'm going to put this in green. We have a local min here. And those are the two local mins. Last vocabulary for this video, we also have a part of the graph that we call the zeros, which this is the same thing as the x-intercepts, and another name for x-intercepts is roots. And so you can see those words used interchangeably, but again, if you see the word zeros or you see the word roots, just remember that means x-intercepts. It is where the graph crosses the x-axis. Algebraically, when we find the zeros or the roots, we look for what values of x do we get when we substitute 0 in for y. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to be doing a lot of solving algebraically with different types of equations. Main thing that I want you to get from this video is just the definitions. So now looking at our last example, if I was to identify where the zeros are or the roots, again, that means the same thing, but the zeros are going to be your x-intercepts. So I have an x-intercept here, I have an x-intercept here, and I have an x-intercept here. So those would all three be zeros. Okay, I hope you took some good notes. Come to class ready to work.